Good morning. It's great to see everyone here. Uh, Good to have the visitors with us. Going around the room, let's remember Angel's dad, who is going to have surgery on the 19th, which will be Wednesday. Uh, and pray for her to have a safe trip. And pray for Tim, since he'll have the kids for that period of time. Also, Dot had another treatment and need to keep her in our thoughts. She didn't. Oh, that's right. It's this coming week. Oh, she's well enough then. She can. She. Oh wow, that'd be great. If you didn't hear that, he said Dot was going to try to come tonight. So, no, this morning. Okay. Uh, Amy is still in the hospital. Linda said she was resting pretty good, but she's still in the hospital waiting on results of the latest test and won't have that till 2 or 3 more days. Holly has been scheduled for her surgery, and it's going to be on the 15th of June. So let's keep her in our prayers. Tina has had another bad week. Charles is uh, still having to have his oxygen. Uh, I just got a text or an email a few minutes ago that both Sheila and Emma are not feeling well, so they'd try to be here tonight, but the Moody's need to keep them in our prayers. Brother Terry had his treatment Friday and said he just sit there for 2 hours or so while it just watched it go in. So we're praying that works well. He did have an opportunity to talk to the surgeon that did the work and get her perspective on a few things. But let's make sure we keep Brother Terry in our prayers. Uh, Anyone else on the sick, injured, wounded? Anderson got the flu. And the Conyers are, some of them, the Bass Rallies are not feeling well. Of course, the Hall family, keep them in mind while they're going through everything. Is anyone else? Brother Luke, would you lead us in a prayer then before we begin class? Amen. Today we're going to look at Jesus walking on the water. And according to the schedule, that's in both Matthew and Mark. I'm going to read the Matthew account, and then we're going to go over and look at the Mark account. And if you just sort of glance at that story as you read over it, it looks like it is fairly simple and cut and dry. But if you sit down and digest it, there is a whole lot of information packed in these verses. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to bring up some speculation and different things for us to think about. But then we're going to go back and look at the scripture as to what it says and try to nail down some items there. Starting in verse 22 of Matthew 14. Straightway, Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and go before him and to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. I said I was going to read the whole story, then we was going to go over to the Mark account, but I want to pause here for just a minute. The fourth watch And this is so I don't forget it when we get over there. What would be the fourth watch of the night, time-wise? And the reason I'm bringing this up is in the Old Testament, you could see first, second, and third watch, but you would not see a fourth watch. And that is because the Old Testament, the way the Jews counted their nighttime, they had it divided up into 3 4-hour sections, first, second, and third. When we get into the New Testament, remember who's in charge of the whole country. So they are starting to take on some of the habits of the Romans as far as the way they count things. It was the Romans that had time divided up into 4 watches, 3-hour segments. So when you look at this, it's talking about the fourth watch then, which would be from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. in the morning. We can also look back at Job, in the book of Job, chapter 9 and verse 18, when it's talking about walking on the sea. So I don't misquote it, let's go back to Job. Job 9 and verse 8. Which alone spreadeth out the heavens and treadeth upon the waves of the sea. So even in the Old Testament there, Job was talking about how great God was, that he's the one that created things and he could do this. But in this case, it was Christ that was walking on water. Verse 26 will continue. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. When Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand, caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come unto the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. And when they were gone over, they came into the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all that country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched were made perfectly whole. Now, as we go through the Mark account, which is in chapter 6, we're going to go back to Matthew on some of the discussion, but we won't have to turn back there because we've read it and we'll just blend it in. But in Mark, we're going to start in chapter 6 and verse 45. And before we do this, remember now, to put things in perspective, when Brother Terry had talked about the feeding of the 5,000 and all Wednesday night, and what we had discussed last Sunday, they had been in and around Capernaum, and when they had sailed over, they had moved eastward across the Sea of Galilee, and now they're on the east bank, and that's where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. And now when we get ready to go and him send them away, they're going to head back toward Capernaum, or Mark tells us Bethsaida, which is, if you've got the sort of oval of the Sea of Galilee, you would have Capernaum here, and then right over here you would have Bethsaida, which is just about where the Jordan comes down to fill the sea there. But verse 45, it says, And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, which he sent away, while he sent away the people. What would you consider it to be if someone constrained you to do something? Are they asking you? They telling you? They forcing you? They encouraging you? What does it mean that he constrained them to get into the ship? More or less forced. You can sort of imagine that they're with him, and he says, y'all get in the ship and go over there. I'm going to do this. And they say, oh, we're going to stay with you. No, you go ahead. I need to do this. So constrained just means a little bit more than asking or giving some gentle directions. Yes, sir, Brother Golden. Right. They, at this particular time, they were wanting him to be, they thought that his mission was to be the earthly king. So, and the multitude was still there. So he sent them away, and then he was going to send the multitude away, and then he was going to be by himself a little while. And what did Jesus generally do when he was going to pray? He went off alone, didn't he? And this is some of what's taking place here. So he had constrained them to go ahead and get in the ship, go to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the people away. So after he got the disciples gone, now he's going to get the multitude to disperse. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. So again, there's just the idea that all of this is happening, and as Brother Golden said, they're really wanting him to be an earthly king, which was not his mission. But he's got to get things under control here. So he sends one group one way and disperses the other, and then he goes so he can be by himself. Questions or comments so far? Verse 47 then says, and when evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. Midst of the sea, what would be the midst of the sea? The middle? So approximately how far from land are we at this point? Brother Terry went through this a couple of weeks ago. I've got a slightly different measurement than he had, but it's all generally the same. 3 to 4 miles. It's about 10 miles long. It's about 7 or 8 miles wide at its widest point. But here, we're not even at the widest point. So if you look at it, it's sort of like an oval. So right up here, if it's in the midst on your east-west range, you're probably about 3 or so miles out to the middle at that point from where they were. And he saw them toiling and rowing. 3 miles away, and he sees them toiling and rowing. Does that sound right? For Jesus, it sounds just fine. He knew that they was out there, all right? For the wind was contrary unto them, and about the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. Now, see, the way I take it is he wasn't still on the shore. He was on his march across to where he had told them to go. He was going over there to join up with them, and then he gets out there close enough. He sees the labor that they're under and all. But what does it mean that he was going to pass them by? They were having trouble. They were in a boisterous sea. Why would he just pass them by and leave them out there? All right, if we don't call on him, he'll pass us by. All right, that's one way to look at it. What would be another way? I think it more that, along with, now, Brother Golden was absolutely correct. If we don't do what we're supposed to and we don't call on him, he's going to. But I think it more that they were not in trouble. Yeah, the seas were kind of rough. Yeah, they were having a hard time, but there was no peril involved. Goes back to the story that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, though, where that they were in serious trouble. And he got up and spoke to the wind. But here, he's just on his way to where he told them he would meet them. He starts to pass them by because they're out there having a pretty tough time. But then what happens? When they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit and cried out. What would we think today if we, or well, let me rephrase that. Have you ever been in a situation where you see something that you cannot identify? Now, I've been in the woods a lot. I've been on the water a lot at night. And depending on the way the light hits certain things, you can be in a totally familiar place. But when the light changes, when the daylight goes and night comes on and the light's hitting things from a different way, I have I have never in my life been lost, but I have been misplaced several times and have to find my way back. I used to fish on Lake Jordan a lot. And when I would go up there at night, it takes on a whole different look at night than it does in the day. And if you're not paying real close attention, you can come out of one of those coves and look around and you might be 2 away from where you thought you were. So here, and seeing something on the water that way, you can go back into our history and look at how many of the ancient mariners, how many tales you have of sea monsters. Were there really sea monsters? Or did they just see something that they didn't quite figure out? You can go as close as in California here. It's been many, many years ago now, but something washed up on the beach, and the people that originally saw it thought it was a type of a sea monster. And one said, well, how could that be? Because they've been extinct for, you got to remember, we're talking about those that believe in evolution. They said, that creature's been dead for 40 million years. How could it be? Well, they come up with this theory that, it was frozen in a block of ice that finally broke loose up here and was drifting down. And as the ice melted, then it washed up on shore. Well, when the people with knowledge came and examined that creature, it was a shark. A shark, a whale. But it was a whale that is very rare and is not normally seen by people. It goes very deep in the water and all like that. But when the right people came along to assess the situation, all these other folks had been wrong. Appreciate you keeping me straight. But anyway, here they saw something that now Jesus been able to walk on water. When they saw him, they saw a figure like a man out there, and it startled them. For they all saw him and were troubled, and immediately he talked with them and saith unto them, be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. All right, now we have to switch back to the Matthew account. Matthew 14. And we're going to pick up at verse 28. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. Somebody give me a brief description of Peter. All right, I'm thinking you're absolutely correct. Peter spoke a lot of times before he engaged his mouth, before he engaged his brain, as we would say today. But if you want to look at one word that would describe him, wouldn't we call him impetuous? So he speaks out and makes that comment because he really didn't, in my opinion anyway, he really didn't think the situation all the way through, because what did he ask Christ to do for him? It's really you, let me walk on water. Now, how many of us today would be brave enough to venture out and walk? Now, remember, they're in the middle. So there's no rocks down there for us to stand on. But Peter had said, you bid me to come out there if you're who you say you are. And he said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Now, again, let's put things in perspective. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about there being a very bad storm. They were in the ship. They needed Christ awake. He was in the back of the boat sleeping. They needed him to save them, literally. Here, they're out there in a storm being tossed about a little bit, no real peril, but the water is still rough. It's bad enough if, I don't know if any of you have, I'm not an ocean person. I don't like the salt water. There's things out there that'll eat you. Just not happy being around it. When I was a youngster, though, I wasn't afraid of anything. I was too dumb to be afraid. So I'd been down and the waves were so high that every time I'd take a step, it'd knock me down. But I didn't care. I had no sense of consequences, young and dumb, as they say. But here, Peter sees that the water is not still, that the waves are crashing around. They're having a hard time. Wind's contrary. So he steps out there anyway. And when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. Didn't he see the wind when he was on the ship? Yeah. What changes from the time he's on the ship, seeing it, and the time he's on the water, seeing it? Okay. Okay. Or 285 around Atlanta. Okay. I want to do it this way. There is a swimming pool in Dallas, Texas. I've never seen it, but it is multi-stories up on this high-rise building. Only it's not on the building. The way they have it constructed, when you walk out into the pool, you walk off of the building and you can look straight down and see the street 40 stories below. Not this character. But the idea, I'm going to try to move it where we were talking. Here, as everybody said, if I'm standing in the pool, I wouldn't even get in the pool, because if that end breaks, where's the water going? I'm going with the water, so I wouldn't even get in it. But while you're on the building, you're standing on something and you feel safe. Now, the first time you step 1 foot out and you look down and there's nothing for however many feet there is, seems to me like it was a 20 or 30-story building. It's up, so a couple of 100 feet anyway. So Peter, while he's on the boat, yeah, the wind's blowing, but I'm okay. But then when he gets in the water, as long as he is focused on Christ and sees Christ there, he's okay. But when he loses focus on Christ and starts thinking about everything else, why did he start sinking? Was it because he saw the wind and the waves and he started what? All right, his faith began to waver a little bit. Right there? Right. Why do you think the rest of them didn't? Always got to be a guinea pig in the group. Okay? And then Christ comes back with him, stretches out his hand and saves him and says, "O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?" So Christ there nailed it. Peter got out of the boat, everything's good. Peter started walking toward Christ, everything's good. Peter lost focus, everything started going south. Took Christ to reach out his hand and save him, and then Christ challenged him. O thou of little faith. My question has always come back to this. If Peter had the faith to step out of the boat, and Peter had the faith to take a step toward Christ, what happened to Peter that now I don't have the faith? Fear? There was no fear when he was on the boat and asked it. There was no fear when he stepped off the boat. Well, I was going to say, would you have gotten out of the boat? It's something for us to really, to me at least, think about, because as we go through challenge, we can move this into us today. As we go through challenges in our life, when we start, we're pretty strong. But as we get into it, how many times do we begin to waver and slip a little bit? And we can focus this around being sick too. I had prostate cancer. When I was diagnosed with it, they came up with, you can do this, this, or this. They gave me 3 options: surgery, do nothing, just watch it, see what happens, or radiation. Well, after they told me about all 3 of the plans, I chose the radiation. Now, every treatment that I took, when I first started my treatment, I was laying on the table there and I was being radiated. Of course, you don't feel anything. And I'm expecting something to happen. How am I going to be cured of this if I don't know something is happening? Second treatment, same thing. Remember, I had to take 42 of them. So you can imagine by the time I had taken my 47, it took 10 or so treatments before I started having any effects afterward that started irritating me a little bit. And then they sort of build. But as far as feeling something that is, a knife going under surgery, you feel it immediately. They did something. But here you're thinking radiation. What's that doing? I don't feel any change. So when I first went into the program, I says, they're going to take care of it, no problem. By the 42nd treatment, hey, I have some effects afterwards, but what did that do? First, I didn't know I had it. Second, I didn't know it was doing anything to get rid of it. It was 6 months after the treatment was over that I went to the doctor and had a PSA test. And the PSA test showed that instead of being here, that particular antigen, way down here to 0. Hey, it worked. Brother Terry, I'm going to put him on the spot. He's had his second infusion. Brother Terry, do you having any similar thoughts that I'm not feeling any results? I don't feel this is making me any better? Not yet. Oh, well, he's got a needle that he feels a stick, but radiation, you don't even feel that. But anyway, so you can sort of see here how in a progression you can start out strong, and then if you don't stay totally focused on the outcome, you can start questioning yourself a little bit. Questions, comments along those lines? But then Jesus, let's go back to the Mark account. And pick up around verse 51. Remember, Peter had been out there and had gone through this experience, and now he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure and wondered. All right. Have we not already gone through one instance where all Christ had to do was speak to the wind and the waters and calm everything down? Here they are back out in that water again, and he steps on board the ship. By the way, anybody remember how big the ship is? Brother Terry told you. Talking about archaeology, finding one around the 1st century and the measurements of it. How many people could be on board? 15 people on board. A fishing boat was generally not for that many people, but for the catch. But it was roughly 26 feet long and roughly 8 feet wide, somewhere in that range. But it's not like a bass boat that we think about today. It was a little bit bigger boat that they was on. But he gets on the boat, and all of a sudden, everything calms down. Where'd they get to? Okay. Verse 52, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Now, to me, the reason they throw that verse in there is the same way that I went back to the first time in the boat. People have a hard time comprehending sometimes. Now, when the 5,000 were fed, what did they start with to feed the 5,000? Did they go to the bakery and order loaves, and did they go down to the ships and to the fishermen and order a catch? Okay, you got 5,000 men. They didn't count the women, so there's probably more than 5,000 sitting there. You got 5,000 plus people sitting there. The fish of that day was not like the whales or anything, but the average size of the fish in those days, the ones that they were catching, was maybe a foot long or less, maybe the size of a crappie today. They had 2 of those. They had 5 loaves of bread. Why did the disciples have a hard time believing that Christ did a miracle when they not only fed 5,000 people, but what did they do with the leftovers? They took up more in leftover than they started with. So how could you be in that presence and not recognize a miracle had taken place? So I find it hard to comprehend that part. I also find it hard to comprehend that the first time they was in the boat that Christ spoke and calmed everything down when they was in real danger. The boat was on the verge of sinking. So now it just takes Christ walking on water, saving Peter, getting in the boat, and now the wind ceased. Do you think they really had comprehension at this point about the miracles, about Christ? One would think so, but if we go to Acts chapter 1 and verse 6, let's go there so I can make sure I read it correctly. Because this is going to tie in with what Brother Golden said just a minute ago. Yes, sir. The Jews always wanted more and more miracles. Acts 1 and verse 6, now this is after Christ was crucified, after he was risen from the dead. 40 days later, he tells them, or is the setting, when they therefore were come together, they asked of him, saying, Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom to Israel? What kind of kingdom? Earthly. And this goes back to the comment that Brother Golden had made about at the time we're talking in our lesson today, is that they were thinking that he was the Messiah was to set up the earthly kingdom. After all these miracles, after his death, after his resurrection, after they had seen him and talked to him after he had been raised from the dead, just before his ascension, they're saying, you here to set up the earthly kingdom? So I don't think they had full comprehension even to that point. Questions or comments? Okay. Well, when you talk about that and the miracles and all, I just keep thinking about how many of them on the Exodus had firsthand knowledge. And now not all of them may have had firsthand knowledge of the 10 plagues, but everyone on the journey had knowledge of the crossing of the Red Sea. Everyone on the journey had knowledge of manna. Everyone on the journey had firsthand knowledge of getting water. But when they get to the promised land, after all this, what happened when they go into the promised land? Or what happened when the spies went into the promised land? 10 out of 12 was negative. Hadn't they just witnessed all this stuff? Didn't they have firsthand knowledge? If God is on our side, who can be against us? Was that not in their thoughts? Apparently not, because then they had to do it the hard way. Yes, sir, it is. Given a gift but didn't know how to take it. That's good. Anything else? And when they had passed over, they came into the land of Gennesaret and drew to the shore. And when they were come out of the ship, straightway they knew him. Who knew him? The people. And ran through that whole region around about and began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was. And whithersoever he entereth into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets and besought him that they might touch, if it were but the border of his garment, and as many as touched him were made whole. Now, the multitude, the people, recognized that he could perform miracles, but apparently the disciples that were with him on a daily basis had a little question about it, right? That's correct. He could do anything he wanted to. So now let's bring that up to April the 16th, 2017. How many people that profess to be religious, profess to believe the Bible, read and do things the right way? Why? It all comes back to what I want, not what God wants. If you think about it seriously, and I've used this before, why do you think, in general, church attendance, worship service is on the decline? People are self-sufficient. What happened in 9/11, after 9/11? All of a sudden they need something. Now people feel like they don't need anything. Right. Right. It seemed like every major upheaval and you can go all the way back in history. What about the Jews? How many times did the Jews get complacent and not do the things that they were supposed to do? And what happened? They'd go into captivity 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years. Then what happened? An awakening. They'd realize they'd come back around, they'd be helped out, might last a generation, and what would happen? Same thing. As Brother Tim said, you didn't learn from history. Self-indulged. Go ahead and say it. Uh-oh. See, that is, to me, and since you brought up the history end of it, to me, that is the biggest mistake that was made at the end of the war between the states. You had all these people that were slaves that had been fully taken care of and everything, and then all of a sudden, you're free, just go. Even animals that have an instinct of survival and an instinct to do, what happens when a group rescues them out of the wild and heals them from whatever problem they had? When they're healthy, do they immediately release them? No. They encourage them to do a little more and a little more and a little more, and then when they see that they're ready, then they release them. So, like I said, that got a little off subject, but I think that was the biggest mistake that was made there. Was they just said, you're free, go do what you want to. And as Tim said, they didn't know how. Thank y'all for your attention and comments. Yeah, that is very probable, because you take us today, if grandkids have grandparents living close by and they see them on a daily basis, no big deal. But if they live where you only see them once a year or so, what's the first comment that generally comes out of the grandparent's mouth? Wow, you've grown. Why didn't the grandparent that saw them every day recognize that? Too close to the situation. Thank y'all again.